Sajid.
My name is Sajid. Here they, please.
Okay, great. And can I get the teams to then introduce themselves? So please introduce your name, who's speaking first, and your gender pronouns if you prefer. If not, we will generally default to gender neutral language anyway by referring to people by their positions. Opening government.
My name is Kai, he can pronounce. PM.
Second speaker from opening government.
Madeline, she, her pronouns, speaking second.
Opening opposition.
I'm speaking first, your day is fine.
Victor speaking second, your day is fine.
Closing gov.
Alicia speaking first, share her, please. Whelan second, share her, please.
And opening, closing off.
Volkan Kılınoğlu for first speaker.
Second speaker, Emir Bodakçı.
Okay, perfect. So speeches are 7 minutes long. I would encourage everybody to please time yourselves. If I could get one person in the panel to just do time signals in the chat, that would be great. Can anybody do it? Okay, Sajid, can you do the time signals? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, so speeches are 7 minutes long. First minute and last minute are protected. We will stop writing after 7:15, so please stop speaking at that point. If there are any questions, I invite the Prime Minister. Here.
Can you hear me? I don't like private school. I hate private school. I think private school is terrible. It's a lottery tickets. First of all, what is the model looks like? There are 4 models I'm going to implement. First of all, I'm going to take the standardized examination as SAT, TOEFL, UK GCSE, all this standardized examination, what we have done in this debate community, get into the university before. And second of all, we are going to actively reform the standardized examination to become more inclusive for the minority students to feel a sense of belonging in the examinations. Also, we are going to recruit to the immigrants' parents who are well educated and to reform the examinations. They become more inclusive, more pluralistic, letting the kids to become more exposure to a variety of cultures through practicing the examinations, more than relying on the homogeneous preconceived notions of what the examinations really looks like. And third of all, we are going to tax the private boarding school, because private boarding school, they have lots of money. We're going to tax these private boarding schools of amounts of money and to fund it to the public school, and to incur, and all this funding will fund the most disenfranchised of communities, such as the Black communities. This is because the Black communities, they don't have a good public school education system, and the most of Black communities, they don't have access to the good public tax. Therefore, we go to this amount of taxings to fund these public schools in order to uplift these students to get the same advantage what the boarding school private students they have as well. So we can take more fairness for the working class students and the immigrant students getting access to public schools. So in this debate, I think that this debate, there are 2 questions. First of all, which size of house can get more fairness for the students? And second of all, which size of house can help the most disenfranchised of the students, such as the minority student and immigrant students? Madeline and I are going to argue to you why in our size of house more likely can gain the fairness on the standardized of examinations. There are 4 points on that. First of all, within the standardized examination actually can truly reflect an individual of competence, how well they can do examination. Why this is true? This is because when the students are practicing examination, they need to use their own competence, more own efforts in order to do the examinations. It's not unlikely what the opposition size of house, their size of houses has to gain the lottery tickets, that all the kids, such as the wealthy kids, they more likely can do better in the private school and get more tutors. Then they could be able to do better in the examinations, which is unfair for the individual students. But like in our model, we're taxing the boarding school, we're using this amount of funding to fund the public school. Actually, we can actually encourage the students to get more fairness for these students to concentrate their own competence, own discipline to do well on the examinations, more than just relying on the alumni of the and at the same time, comparatively, in opposition side of the house, in their side of the house existing the interview, only the boarding school can help these students to gain more of legitimacies of qualified being good students. This is because the boarding school, they will teach their students to tell them there are specific questions you need to ask in order to think that you are qualified to become the elite in the Uxbridge of the institutions. From this instance, we think it's unfair for the students who are doing in the public school because they don't have access to practice the interview. This is the biggest burdens for the opposition they have as well. Unlike in our side of the house, we can actually only concentrate on the standardized examinations that students who are not going to have the admissions no longer have the bias to toward these students, does not have an access practice on the interview. And the second point, why we think the working class students accessing the public school needs to be same with the private schools. This is because the private schools is like a lottery tickets. Like the private school also is only relying on the people who has a privileged backgrounds to need to have a patronage of the networks, because they need to check your family history. Then you could be able to get to the Eton and St. Paul's, and like these, the schools, they can actually have a good connections to get into a better chance to get into the Uxbridge. But in our side of the house, once we could be able to implement this policy, this is the first time we can going to see the fairness for the working class students to use the standardized examination, start on the same lines with the private the students who in the private school institutions to do the examinations and to get more fairness in our side of the house. And that's the one of the things why we can wait better that let the working class students to gain more fairness of asset during the examinations in order to get into the good schools, what we call the Uxbridge as well. And third point, once we are going to implement this policy, it will change the way we are going to view public school. The students and parents are going to have more faith on the public schools. Parents are no longer panic, only think about how we can actually push our kids to go into a private school. Because private school always seems as the better. But in our side of the house, once we're going to implement this policy, it is the first time we are going to see that parents are no longer to panic and think about that, push their kids only think about to go to private school and waste so much effort to think that how we can put more qualified and to make these teachers become more better. But we can actually to push the students, teachers, parents are going to think private school actually are better, and the working class students in the public school actually can get more faith that in the public schools institution they can feel better and feel more qualified in the institution. I can take PO and CO. Okay. Why we can do better? Last point. Why we can do better for the minority students and the immigrant students? This is because in the opposition side of the house, they have a lottery tickets that only the rich parents can send their kids to go to private school and hire the good tutors to do well on the examinations. But in our side of the house, once we actually can, within the model, within the amounts of funding to actually make the examination become more inclusive, because on account of the differences in the examination, actually we can do better to help the students gain uplift in the working class student community. Let's wait which side of the house actually can help better for the minority student, immigrant students. In the opposite side, even if their private school can provide the scholarship for the private school students, but we still think it's not better because this will actually tokenize the minority students, not feel a sense of inclusivity in the community. But in our side of the house, once we have examination, people are not going to think about going to private school. We can actually do better to help the student all start on the same lines.
We thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Let's now invite the Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Thank you. I want to check that I'm audible only by audio. Also try to turn on my camera, but it's not working. I want to make sure that the default with just audio is fine. It's okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I'll also open my camera. One sec. All right. If I'm audible, then I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Right, like one point of extremist rebuttal, and then I'll get to the points. Most of my rebuttal will be integrated. So like, but the government tells us that we will tax private schools. Look, most of their benefits, or like the model, are not mutually exclusive, but also, like, crucially, don't solve the gap you create when you actually move everything in the admission process to focus upon standardized testing. Because there is only as much as some funding can do of state school, because there will always be disadvantage because there are more students in the class, because the teachers can't focus on them that much. But also crucial to remember that standardized testing will also advantage the Eton kids. Like, we don't think the delta is that big in their world, but also we think that this is like weirdly on the motion, right? We can also argue that we can implement blind interviews, for example, like to make sure that the university doesn't know where the students come from, like what school they come from, and that apparently solves every problem that government seems to be having. So no, these are not exclusive to standard testing. Now, getting into the actual content, what do we have to stand for as a position? One, obviously, like a version of the status quo, we can also implement improvements, right? So a mix between standardized testing and non-quantitative ways of accepting them. For example, motivational essays with the results combined with the result of stats, for example, SATs, for example, or the US system, where the essays not only require you to develop to describe your motivation, but also like your involvement in your community, because universities acknowledge that the people that are more that is a criteria that they want to take into consideration, right? Or for example, essays that ask students to describe their special circumstances that impeded or aided them to get into the study of that discipline, in order to assess other things about that student that cannot, and this is crucial, can never be only measured by standardized testing. I'll get into the analysis later. Or essays that, for example, describe their connection with the domain of studies. Non-quantitative ways of assessing students is crucial. Notice that this is not symmetric, right? Because it is far easier for a student that doesn't have, for example, private tutoring to do a good essay without help or with little help, because they focus more on your personal experience and the essays are assessed on this. So like the involvement of the student in an interview, for example, or in an essay is far greater. And even if he doesn't have a good context later, even if he doesn't have a good context, he can still make a really good essay that gets him admitted, or really good interview, as opposed to standardized testing that is crucially dependent on what area you're coming from. So why is standardized testing not enough? A, it doesn't account for a bad day, right? It only assesses how well you did in those 2 hours in which that test takes place, right? It's a very singular and instant reaction marker, which are obviously not telling of that student's overall ability to know maths, for example. Secondly, they don't account for motivation or reaction or spontaneity or logical reasoning, which obviously do matter in the parcours of that specific student inside the university, and which can be tested when you have a mixed system of admission, right? Because you can test logical reasoning in an interview or in an essay. You can test motivation in an essay, and we believe that they are far more overarching. Secondly, they having a specific background or context can make you perform far better or far worse in that subject. And thirdly, the level of motivation cannot be assessed through standardized testing. And this is crucial, right? Because the university doesn't only have an incentive to get people admitted, because it is non-mandatory. It's crucial for people to be able to finish that university, right? Which means that motivation is the thing that you should be able to measure, and you cannot do that through SATs. I'll take closing if they have something. All right, now then I'll move on. It is illegitimate because people have asymmetries of resources, right? The social context determines whether or not you do good in that thing. If you had good tutors, or like a rich school that had preparatory classes for SATs, for example, you will definitely get a proportionally far better result, which means that people from minorities, or like people from public schools, which by the way are not aided, as I have explained, that much by their model, will perform significantly worse, and you create a huge gap into the amount of how much context matters and how much that person can input in order to get into uni. Also, You might be very spontaneous and good at understanding math, for example, but if you haven't learned all the theorems, you will get a lower grade at your SATs, and you will be highly disadvantaged from a person that just remembers things well, but doesn't have a complete understanding of math, for example. Secondly, different countries have really different curricula, and international unis have interviews and motivational essays precisely because it's impossible to assess just by standardized testing. For example, universities in Romania would never accept UK people just by standardized testing because they don't have the curricula that fits the requirements of the university. The only way you can account for that is by also using non-quantitative measures. What is the impact of this? You risk to cut out people that would be really suited for your university. That is obviously bad for university because a lot of their revenues come from international students or students from disadvantaged countries. Yes, Sajid.
Considering that non-quantitative methods are surrounded by being able to fill up a CV with things like Habitat for Humanity and Amnesty, how does this benefit students who don't have the time to do these things because they have to work to support their families?
All right, thank you. So I have explained to you that there are very different types of essays that can ask for your input in your community for mitigating circumstances. So it's really not only CV, like it's interviews where you can explain or other stuff. I think that's a tackle that. Second impact, you might not have access in your country to a good uni, and this sort of mix between standardized and non-quantitative actually might aid you to get into a better context, irrespective of where you were born. Also crucial, talent is rewarded because it is like the get-go, the point where you start when you enter uni is not a good indicator of how well you might perform were you to be put in a better environment, which is the university. So I believe that only assessing how much you know without assessing the ability of you growing, which can be assessed by non-quantitative, is really unfair. Lastly, obviously, this is disadvantageous for minorities, and even if quotas still exist, they can only go as far because they become unflexible. This also hurts autonomy of the university. My colleague will elaborate on that. They need to defend exclusivity. We can defend a mixed model.
We thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. Let's now invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. Right, so to start off with, we want to make clear as opening government that as long as there are students with huge economic advantages, of course there's always going to be this like unbalance in education as there is in every other field of life. However, as opening government, what we're saying is that opposition is doing nothing to close that gap, and we are hugely closing it, and the only way that you can do this properly is through this testing. Okay, so first I'm going to go through some rebuttal. So the first point is Eton's kids are still going to do better, like they're still going to have an advantage even if you standardise testing, and I do want to pick up on that. That is true because you're always going to have, like when you're a child and you have smaller class sizes with longer hours, more homework, then of course, like if you go like, which is what you're offered at a private school, then of course you're always going to do better. But the point, like, of course, if you have this asymmetry of resources, you're always going to do better. However, as I'm going to go on to say later, like this is massively reduced with standardized testing. And secondly, I think the reason why we're so opposed to non-quantitative methods is that the places where private school kids really shine is not actually the standardized testing that we're talking about. It's in things like, as was mentioned in the POI, like it's doing things like Amnesty International, doing extracurricular activities, it's having access to tutors who would have, you know, taught at Russell Group or Ivy League. Like it's having that kind of extra resource that your average state school kid could only dream of having during their secondary and primary and college and primary school education, which really tips edge when it comes to interviews, when it comes to essays, because they just have this wealth of resources at the moment, which simply isn't available for the rest of the kids in the country. Okay, so a second rebuttal I want to talk about is talent is rewarded. That is not true. And that if you really want to say that talent is rewarded, the best way you can do that is through standardized testing, where every single kid goes through the same test, where it doesn't matter whether you come from an economically undeveloped background, you come from Eton, you're still going to do the same test. So if you're more intelligent, if you're better at retaining information, if you're directly if you're just academically stronger, you're still going to have a better chance than if you sorry, I didn't start my timer, so I don't know how. Yeah, okay, sorry, I didn't start, so I don't know when it's going to stop. You don't, yeah, so is more rewarded in a standardized testing, which I'm going to go through now. Okay, so I'm going to go through what is the current status quo, why it's fundamentally unfair, and what happens when you only use standardized testing in terms of what universities are then pushed to do because they have to do it, and why it actually advantages students. Okay, so firstly, what is the status quo? So my partner's already outlined the problem with schools like St. Paul's and Eton having such a wealth of resources, what that does for students in terms of how they perform so much better in interviews and essays, where they have professors and they do loads of practice to make sure that they really hone in the skills that they know that universities want, which other students are simply not capable of accessing. So what does this do from a university point of view? Okay, so in the current status quo, I don't see why there is any real push for universities to actually open up their fields, because when say you're a tutor and you do significantly better in interviews because they've been popped literally since year 9 to do better in these interviews, they've been getting all these tidbits. Of course, as a human, you're going to think they're a better student, right? You're going to give them the place because they know what they're doing, because their private school props them up. So yeah, there's no overwhelming inclination for universities to actually open up their gates to making it more equal. And the way that you can see that is in almost every country, private school kids do so much better. The fact that they make up 5% in the UK, and they're 40% of Russell Group students, even with quotas, that's not going to get fixed. We've seen it again and again and again. The status quo is favouring private school kids in a considerable manner. As a so yeah, as my partner said, if you have the lottery ticket of being born in a wealthy family, and going to a good school, and then being able to be given right resources to really push you over the edge. Oh, thank you for the minute counts. Then yeah, you're going to do so much better. So from a university point of view, the current status quo has no incentive to properly help the average school student. So what happens when you use standardized testing? Well, this evens out, because yes, although you can still have tutors, etc., when you go to a private school, you're still using pretty much the same textbooks, and you're still on exam day. Yes, as they've said, you could have a bad day. You could have a bad day in any school. You could have a bad day as a private school student, but as long as if you've really propped up, so say it's the difference between getting an A and an A. Well, if you've done all this amazing stuff on the side because you went to a private school, getting that, getting that A is not really as big a deal, because getting an A instead of an A star is not as big a deal as whether getting that A and going to a school where that was the only thing you had to put to universities, because the rest of the time you're either working or you're looking after your family or whatever. So even with the fact that yes, it's not a perfect system, it's still so much more favorable to the average public school child. Because the smartest one, the one who wants to go the furthest, can actually access that now, when all that they've got, when all that a private school can do in order to match it is do the same test, whereas they don't have to do all the extra interviews, blah blah blah. So yeah, why should you vote for this motion? Because there's no current incentive for universities to do anything different. There's no incentive for private schools to do anything different, and public school kids are not in a position where they can truly shine when a private school kid who's had so much propping up that they look infinitely better as a candidate for university. For that reason, very, very proud to propose.
We thank the DPM for that fine speech. Let's now call upon the DLO. Here.
Can you hear me? Is this okay? Am I audible? Is it good? Okay, okay. Second. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. So first of all, tackling their point about rich kids basically getting like a lot more advantages when we don't have standardized testing. So first of all, I just want to know that I don't think this is like that big of an impact realistically, because these like rich kids will still get a lot of, I don't know, private tutoring right now. Like private schools will just change their focus rather than, I don't know, getting these kids into NGOs and getting them into like extracurricular activities, into pumping information and prepping for SATs and for other standardized testing into them. So I don't think it's like the biggest impact. Second of all, I think if they have the fiat to like tax private schools in order to, I don't know, create programs for like kids from public school, I think we can do the same thing, but for extracurricular activities, right? Pushing more NGOs, for instance, to go into public schools, which again is already a thing that happens in most of the, like in most like liberal democracies. NGOs have an active interest to go into these specifically disadvantaged communities in order to provide programs for them, because that's like where they get their biggest impact, right? Because that's why they're NGOs, in order to provide this form of like alternative education and so on and so forth. But thirdly, just note that we can also reform interviews. We can also reform any form of like essays and so on and so forth, right? This means that, for instance, we can do, as Anna told you already, blind interviews, where your like school your school name doesn't appear there anymore, so nobody will know that you're from Eton. We can do interviews in which, I don't know, what matters more is your background and the personal experiences you've been through, maybe like the bad experiences you've been through, how you've I don't know, gotten over discrimination, how we've gotten over being poor and so on and so forth. So they can be very, very specialized on our side if we reform them as well. Fourthly, though, I think that universities do have an active incentive to accept more disenfranchised students and like students from public schools for a number of reasons. So firstly, I think that they just get like they seek talents, right? So they want people that are very, very talented. This means that interviews are catered in a certain way to focus on your personal experience and to focus on your, I don't know, critical thinking and so on and so forth. So these universities do have an active interest to get the best students there. Secondly, I think they also have an interest to get the most motivated students rather than the best like academic students. Why? Because what matters, as Anna tells you, and I think they ignore, is the fact that what matters for these universities is for you to finish, right? It doesn't matter. You don't get more funding as a university based on the number of admissions you have. You get more funding as a university based on the number of academic papers that you publish, based on the number of research that you have, based on the number of people that are employed and employable, right, after they finish that university. So you have an active interest to, rather than seek the best academic students, right, to seek the most motivated one. I think public school students have a huge advantage over like Eton and other like privileged schools, precisely because they are way more motivated. They haven't lived their whole life in fluff, and they will get more advantages from this. Thirdly, I think they also have an incentive because of PR, right? Because it's bad for you as a university to just get, I don't know, to just get like kids from Eton and whatnot. That's why they have quotas. That's why, I don't know, we can like increase those specific quotas and so on and so forth. They want to be multicultural, etc., etc. Now, on to why standardized testing is bad and how this affects university incentives. So firstly, I think that universities like elite universities such as Oxbridge will still have an incentive to make these standardized testings as harsh as possible, right? This does not account, and this is exactly what Anna tells you, and I think they don't tackle, the fact that people have different backgrounds, right? So you might be, I don't know, you might not know anything about like, I don't know, like programming languages. You might not know a lot of programming languages, but maybe you have a very, very good analytical mind, right? I think this can only be tested in an interview in which you discuss, I don't know, logic problems with that specific individual. So standardized testing wouldn't account for this. This means that you don't get the best and most motivated students. I think this actively hurts universities and actively hurts the students that get there, right? Because those students might, I don't know, drop out or might not like, might not be the best, might not be able to take the good grades in courses and so on and so forth. But secondly, just know that the elite universities will make this harsher because they want to maintain their elite status, right? Which means that they will still advantage kids that can afford private tutoring, right? Because the main issue that public schools have, I think, and that is probably unfixable, is the fact that they have like worse, I don't know, worse curriculums or worse teachers and so on and so forth. So they don't get as much information, they don't get as much prep for forms of standardized testing. Whereas, for instance, for interviews or for any essays and other types of things, these are not dependent on the quality of your school necessarily. Okay, so you can still get like a lot of benefits from your background. Or from like your like motivational essay and so on and so forth at the moment which that happens. I'll take CG if they have anything, if not OG. OG.
Look, in your side of house, you will still have bias that the elite school, that they know what to write in the motivation essay in order to go to Oxbridge. This is because the kids who go to Eton, they more likely can actually to get into the best private school. In our side, how we actually can get more justify on that side.
So I agree that like bias will obviously exist, and like rich kids will be rich kids and rich kids will get advantages on both sides of the house. What we are arguing is that at the moment which you have standardized testing, and because precisely you don't have like subjective criteria, right? Because what is important here is subjective criteria that motivational essays and interviews can insert, right? I don't know, an interview can be spontaneous, right? If they say that you're anxious, they might be more comforting, right? Whereas in a standardized test, you get absolutely no comfort there, right? If you just had a bad anxious day and you're generally anxious, no one will help you. If you're anxious in an interview, the interviewer might help you. And again, I've already explained why these interviewers have all of the incentives to do this, right? Because they want the best students, because they want motivated students, and because they want to have like a good PR essentially. Now, moving on into like two more quick points. So firstly, academic freedom, right? Because what Anna tells you is that different universities have very, very different specializations, right? So for instance, you probably can have, I don't know, standardized testing for maths, but I think this would be very, very bad for an arts university, right? Where what doesn't matter isn't necessarily your portfolio as much, rather than what your ideas are, right? And how you want to express them. I think these type of things, such as like motivation, how you want to, I don't know, revolutionize the art world and so on and so forth, can only happen at the moment in which you have at the moment that you have these other like alternative forms, non-quantitative forms of assessment, right? Because there are things that are non-quantifiable, right? Such as your artistic merit and so on and so forth. This essentially means that you force universities to like have a very, very like, I don't know, strict form of admission that does not account for all of the things. This is bad for universities because it makes them like have worse students essentially. Last point about parents and how this will affect like parent incentive. I think at the moment which you know that your child has like like can still do interviews and can still get admitted to like a university, whatever that university is, and you don't have to pay anything, you're way more likely to encourage your child to go to university, and that child is way more likely to want to go to university, right? At the moment which you know that you will have to pay private tutors, for instance, even if you're not that poor, right? If you're like, I don't know, lower middle class or something, and you cannot afford because you have limited resources, that's the moment which you are way less likely to encourage, for instance, your child to go to university, because you know they have a worse shot at going through without standardized testing. At the moment which you have alternative criteria that are not based on your knowledge, that are not based on what education you received, I think that's the moment which it's way more likely to encourage your child to go to university. That's when we get more talent that is rewarded. Thank you. Sorry for.
We thank the DLO for that fine speech. Let's now invite the member of government. Here.
Yeah, can everyone hear me? Yep. Cool. Give me 1 second there. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Both standardized and non-quantitative methods will always benefit the elite and privileged students, because university to some extent will always favor the elite and will always favor this wealthy. This debate is not about achieving a totally unbiased education system and university access. It's about, because we believe that's never truly going to happen, it's about how you minimize it to such an extent that traditionally locked out students can finally have access to the one thing that society deems as most important, which is a university degree. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to tell you comparatively why this offers the least biased form of access. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you and be the only team to tell you about why this achieves the one true aim of the education system. But before that, 2 points in response to OO. Firstly, they tell us that essays and interviews can be used to share your community and personal experience, and therefore are easier for students from these minority groups to gain access. I think this is principally beneficial. I think on principle, it's a nice idea. Let's be realistic about it. 3 responses. 1, if this is true, universities wouldn't act the way they act. Universities wouldn't be as elitist and as biased as they are. Secondly, essays and interview prep are afforded by the most elite students. You can pay a tutor to help benefit you to give a better essay, to give a better interview, which means you're still another advantage above the students that OO claim to help. And thirdly, I think when they tell you that, look, your background is this great thing that you can use to get into college, I think oftentimes background works as a detriment due to the elitism of university, because most of the times when you enter an interview and you are not connected and you have an accent, you don't look like what they think a university student in Oxford or Cambridge or Berkeley should look like, they don't let you in. Second point in response to OO. They tell us that standardized testing doesn't account for motivation or ambition. 3 responses here also. Firstly, they tell you that standardized testing doesn't account for a bad day in the same way an interview doesn't account for a bad day. Queen and I tell you comparatively standardized testing is over like a 2-year basis. Generally, you have more time to prepare for it. Therefore, it's more fair. Secondly, they tell you it is unfair because it doesn't account for motivation. I think it is incredibly unfair to students under standardized testing system, say that they are not hardworking, say that they are not motivated. Comparatively, it accounts for more hardworking working class students because they don't have to deal with someone who just gets into college because they had that connection in a university interview. I'd say it is actually more unmotivating if you know you'll never get in because you never had the time to be in Amnesty International, you never had the time to go build a house somewhere. We say that's more unmotivating. And thirdly, we say it's just frankly unfair to the thousands of Irish students who work their asses off every 2 years for the leaving certificate. That is a standardized test. Say they're not motivated to the many students around the world for that. Let's move into substantive. Comparatively, why this offers the least biased form of access. So firstly, I just think, look, university access will always have some level of bias. We would say it's a wash on both sides. We say, oh, actually increase that because they allow 2 forms of privilege to come across. Because yes, they still have tutors, but now they can also just have the connections they always had to get into college to pay for that prep. We say that's worse. This debate is about an action we take to minimize it because look, in a standardized test, you are a number. They know nothing about you. In a non-quantitative, most of the time, you are a name. A name will always hold more weight in the elitism of university because there are white names, there are black names, there are connected names, there are known names, there are unknown names. If you have the kind of name that suits for that university, you will always have a privilege over someone else. Standardized testing removes that. That's why we back it. But we think the stakeholders in this debate are twofold. We think they're traditionally locked out students from minorities who don't have the time to be able to fill out a CV like this. But they're also kind of middle ground students who feel disenfranchised with the status quo, who feel like they never get that. Because we think the people who don't have the privilege of time to be able to fill up a CV and make themselves more interesting to a college interviewer are always going to be at a disadvantage. It doesn't take into account how hard they work in school on top of everything else going on in their lives, because if they just kind of bolted in that interview or they don't have the correct answers or they didn't do the correct extracurriculars like debating of all things, then they don't get in. That's what this debate is about. How does standardized testing treat you then? It ignores circumstance, which we actually think is a benefit more than a detriment, because it puts you as even in the eyes of that university with everyone else. And even though that may not be true, it is most important for the university to see you as the same, because they will not be disadvantaged against you. What are the impacts you get with standardized testing being comparatively the least biased form of access? We think the impacts are one, there's just a greater access for locked out students. We think like this is the reason why like things like Irish universities are generally more diverse than like Durham or Columbia, because it means that everyone is treated in the same, at least when it comes to access. We mean like when OO tell you, well, you know, they'll accept you because of your diversity because they need that for advertising. We actually think that's such a harmful thing, because then you're just seen as an affirmative action. You're just seen as someone in there. Your college experience is ruined because everyone just sees you as something to be put on a brochure. We think that is incredibly harmful. We think the second impact of this is that there's just greater diversity on campus. Look, that means that more people, both like traditional students who go, those don't have access to wider viewpoints. It means you're likely to have more supports in your university. It means you're likely to have more supports in your university and expansion of services in terms of that. We think that, look, on oppositions, locked out students will still get into college, but this is minimal. Their experience will be detrimental because there's not enough people around them that can support them and know how they need to support. Before I move on to the aim of the education system, I'll take a vote.
If you don't have time to prep for an interview or to write an essay, how would you have time to, like, I don't know, study a lot for an SAT, for instance?
Yeah. Okay, so the thing is, in fact, that is that, like what I've already told you, comparatively standardized testing is over a longer basis of time. It means you have more time to prepare for it, unlike an interview, which ultimately is something that you won't be doing for the 2 years before. Standardized testing at least means that you have support over those 2 years. It means that you're not just trying to write an essay in like a month, whatever. Let's move into why the aim of the education system is so important, because we think the aim of the education system is to further yourself. It is to change the circumstances you're in to improve your life. Education is the ability to do this. We think university is important. And note that Queen and I are the only team in this debate who will tell you distinctly why university is important. So we think it does a number of things. We think one, like society just values it. We think society has just decided that a university degree is probably like the best thing you can have to be successful. We don't really know why they did that, but they did. And you need to play into that, because a university degree is the difference between a job you enjoy and pays you enough and a job that just barely has enough to scrape by. We think university is important because it widens your your worldview, because it creates connections needed for life, because it gives you the kind of education you can't get anywhere else. Non-quantitative methods, the analysis I've given you about them being so unfair to the majority of students, prevent further access from it, which prevents you from achieving this aim of furthering yourself. Look, we think like this debate ultimately benefits the most kind of middle ground road of students and those who are traditionally not going to college, because at least in the eyes of their university are the same. At least their motivation isn't determined by whether or not they had time to do an extracurricular, or whether or not they had time to make those kind of connections, whether or not their dad knows someone on their board or their mother was working with someone who has some kind of say in it. Because this debate is ultimately about who do you benefit. Elite students will always be benefited in university. We have to take action to benefit those who are traditionally locked out. Standardized testing does the most. CG.
We thank the member of government for that fine speech. Let's now invite the member of opposition. Here.
Okay. So I'm going to tell 4 things. Firstly, I'm going to mention to the legitimacy point of the debate, you cannot force the university to apply that standard tests. And secondly, I'm going to tell we cannot analyze the whole abilities and interests on the test of students. And thirdly, I'm going to tell candidates have already been tested and can participate to the tests like SATs, or they have already been tested on their high schools. And fourthly, and the special point of us, the high school system will change by that system. But firstly, I'm going to give some answers to the government side. And they said that system is basically unfair for students, especially for discriminated communities. But creating equal access to opportunities is a trend today. So many colleges provides financial aid for students from negatively discriminated communities. And because A, they have awareness, B, they can use that for PR, promotion of their awareness to be more ethical or aware university to the Black community, or to be more global by admitting the immigrants. And you can mention that on your essays. And it's the special point, because but if you have no opportunity to write an essay on the standardized test system, they will never be informed about your negativities, your negative opportunities, and you have not access to the opportunities on equal standards. And standard testing is still not equal for all of the participants. If you are rich, you can take the tutors, online courses. There are still inequalities that you cannot solve, and the instrument they are different. But in our scenario, we can save that groups because they can explain their difficulties. They can explain that they are from the Black communities or they are immigrants, that they have many difficulties on the college application, and they can explain themselves on the essays. But if you delay that scenario, you cannot save them. And actually the tutor of essay took like an hour, but for standard test you need a year for preparation, and it's very rich person for them. And firstly, I'm going to tell the legitimacy point of the debate. You cannot force them, the university, to accept that students, because university might have different visions and educational systems, and they want to maybe cultivate at the different areas of the students, and they want to promote the social activities or clubs like debate related to the business life or something like that. And you cannot force the universities because university must be independent and self-governing. That's important because the universities create the future generation, and to have a free science at the future, we need to have a free and independent universities. And you can not ban some systems that they can accept the students. And secondly, university can select students more suitable for them. For example, if you want students from they want academical career, you can take them by their CVs and their activities on their high school lives. Or if they want to be a part of the corporate life, they can mention that on their essays. And you cannot be aware of the students' needs, or is it suitable for you if you apply this standard test. You have no legitimacy to force to apply standard admission requirement to universities. And second point of the debate, we cannot analyze the whole abilities and interests on the test. On the test, we have multiple choices or we have free response questions, but on some just specific areas like science, physics, math, history, or other areas. But you cannot have the all areas like sports or social awareness or social activities you can mention there. And those are more important for some universities because they want to accept students like that, or students that want to be improve themselves on that area, that want to be a part of that university. For example, there are Harvard students, they are immigrants and they are basketball player on MBA. We think it's more effective solution for the Harvards in order to take a nerd and hardworking test participant. And third point of the debate is, candidates have already been tested or participate exams on high schools. If you are a university which focus on academical success like GPA, high school tests, you can accept them, that measures or that standards. You are free to do that. And universities already use different measuring methods of testing like SAT, or that creates the variety and more option to select. By that liberal model, all students can find which university is more suitable for them. And opening government can ask.
Both sides, opposition sides, have take criticism on standardized examinations. But however, according to OG model, we will reform the standardized examination toward more creativity, toward more inclusivity for the disadvantaged sizes of the students' communities.
Yeah, actually, we mentioned that because there's a still reaction. There is still reaction of the society today, and they need to provide them because there's a reaction on the society, and they're not to be discriminated as a university of the top university of the country. And if you have not opportunity to improve yourself on the social areas or supports on the high school years, you can still go to university that accepts you, because they can accept you by your test scores, and you can go to university that's like that more suitable for you and improve your skills here, and you have more opportunity on campuses and colleges like that. And fourth point, the special point of us, high school will prepare their students for that standardized tests, because every high school want to have prestige, and their prestige is their alumni who are students of or who are graduated from top universities. If we change the admission system of entrance to the universities, other institutions of education like high schools will change their system too. They will do less experiments or less social activities on science schools or history lessons or something like that on the high school years, because students don't need to solve tests, don't need them for solving the tests, and they will become to the test course. The high schools will become test course for the students, because they are applying to universities by that standards. B, if they don't change themselves, the high schools, other schools to change them systems and prepare for testing system, and other students will trying to go that high schools, and they need to change themselves, and it harms for high school students too. If you want to be a sport player, no one will promote yourself, you're in that system, and free thinking will be full. And that's all. Thank you.
We thank the member of opposition for the fine speech. Let's now invite the government whip. You're here.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. 1 second. Okay, I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. Look, realistically, panel, the elite students, the students who go to elite, students who go to Eton, students who go to private schools are always going to have more time to prepare for entering college. However, what they also have is access to expertise, access to people who have already taken a Cambridge or an Oxford interview and know what things that those interviewers like to hear in order to admit you to that college. It's this expertise that we are cutting out when we are reverting to standardized testing. So 2 questions I'm going to be dealing with in this speech, I'm going to be talking about how comparatively we take away advantages of the most elite students. And secondly, I'm going to be talking about how we increase access to universities. But before that, two explicit responses to what we just heard from the last speaker. So this idea about can we force, like, is it legitimate to force universities to do this? I mean, like, first of all, OG just have fiat, as in this is the motion, so that is what we are going to do. Of course we can. But like, furthermore, let's look at the actual analysis of it. This idea around universities being able to decide what type of people they admit to them because they create the future generation of leaders. Like, notice how problematic that line of analysis is. That is specifically why you lock out the most disadvantaged, the most disenfranchised students. What you're doing is you're giving universities the power to dictate what type of person that they want to be leading the country within 20 years. You never solve the systemic problem at the point at which universities are more concerned with protecting their reputation as an elite and an expensive college as to actually giving people a chance at an education. But secondly, what I'm just going to briefly clear up this kind of challenge around, like, well, what if the university just wants to focus on sports instead of maths? I mean, like, look, at the point at which, like, and loads of countries do this, such as Ireland, where we have standardized testing, like, you just do different subjects, like PE is a subject that you can take a standardized test in. Not sure why that doesn't solve this problem. But look, that's actually a really bad line of analysis, right? There are some subjects that everyone should just be tested on because that supports elitism. At the point at which you only offer certain subjects in, like, elite schools, or other subjects are more associated with, like, working class schools, such as, like, maybe woodwork, that then they are not, like, able to be used to get into the more elite universities. That's very problematic, not something we're ever going to stand over. But on to the first question, this idea around comparative advantage. Like, look, I said it before, Alicia told you why this is true. It's really important to note that people who go to private schools at the Eton elite are always going to be going to university. They have extra tuition. They have an expectation of getting a university education. What actually changes? Let's look at what we got out of OO. So first of all, it's really interesting that they concede that they can have blind interviews, because what they're doing is they are conceding that it is indeed damaging if an interviewer knows who you are, what your name is, what color your skin is, and what school you went to, right? Seems problematic, but let's go further. Alicia tells you how even if it's a blind interview, something is them just having your name or, like, a specific area of the country that you come from is incredibly detrimental, at the point at which they have implicit biases, that the college is meant to be for the elites, or they recognize a friend's or they recognize a name that is associated with going to college, with being elite, or they recognize a surname that belongs to a minority group and think that they do not fit the type of student that we want within this university. You change that at the point at which everyone is a number on a piece of paper and had to take the same standardized test. But, like, even if they're able to get their brilliant blind interviews, which we tell you is unlikely, they're actually just trying to keep anonymity, which is our case. I don't know why you wouldn't just do ours. That's simpler. But look, I'm going to explicitly weigh this idea of, like, essays, which are probably relatively anonymous, versus tests. Look, when they tell you about the types of things that they want in essays, they concede their entire case. When they talk about community involvement, we tell you that you have to be rich to a certain extent, that you can be involved in your community voluntarily and don't have to work jobs, that you rely on your parents knowing from a young age that you're meant to be involved in your community. Like, when we see a US actress lying about, like, activities her daughter is involved in order to get her into college, we tell you that the advantage that things like essays, that things like interviews are offered to students whose parents just know how the systems work is incredibly unfair. But furthermore, onto this idea of special circumstances, I am really unsure why members of minority and disadvantaged groups are going to should have to be able to explain and use their circumstances as almost a bargaining chip to gain access into university. That's incredibly emotionally taxing. Why are we forcing the most vulnerable people to do that? But when we compare that to a test, why is this always better on our side? We tell you that you are a number, you don't have an accent, you don't have a skin color. That's not something that can be weaponized against you. Furthermore, it just is easier for teachers to support, because look, yeah, the kid from Eton has more time to study. However, it is relatively easier for your teacher in an overcrowded school to just send you on past past papers and marking schemes and you to self-motivate yourself than your teacher from that public school not being used to how, like, the Oxford interview system works and not being able to give you correct guidance for that. But furthermore, this idea, like, we got a challenge that Oxford will still set harsh standardized tests. Like, that's the point, they can't because it's standardized. But look, comparatively, we tell you on our side of the house, fewer children are disadvantaged. It's really unfortunate for the opposition side that they never dealt with it, said it was a wash because everyone would always be disadvantaged. look, yes, some children will always be disadvantaged. We can make that to a lesser extent on our side. So we have to win. But okay, on this idea of increased access to university, like, look, the point at which you are less disadvantaged and less locked out of the system, you are more likely to go. First of all, because the system itself is less biased against you. I will take OO now.
White children generally have more time and get more, rich children have more attention from like their teachers, right? So when you turn them into a number, why isn't it more likely statistically they would get more white kids into universities rather than people from minorities?
Okay, look, I've literally already explained to you like the whole point how, like, yes, more advantaged students have more time. However, at least now they don't have the extra expertise access because it's not required. But anyway, going on. Look, too, we tell you at the point at which you're not going to get into university because you know that the entire system is rigged against you, that it seems more pointless to apply. Alicia explained to you how incredibly unmotivating that is when you may not, like, you shouldn't even bother applying to Oxford because they're going to hear your accent and not want you in that college. We tell you how damaging that is. That was never dealt with. Alicia brought that to you, but the specific impacts that she brings you is this idea of being better for your mental health because you are more accepted on campus, because you are not a PR stunt. Like, it's really bizarre that both CO and OO wanted to run that, like, universities just accept you as like a disadvantaged kid because like it looks good for their university. Like, you're less likely to have things like support groups and actual support on campus for their students, at the point at which people resent them for being like a tokenistic gesture, like the point at which people are all getting in on their own merit. That is incredibly beneficial on our side. But look, Alicia explains to you explicitly why education is so important because of the value that we attach to it. The point at which we give more people access to that, we have to win this debate. Thank you.
We thank the government whip for that fine speech. Let's now invite the opposition whip to end off the debate. Here.
Hello, my speech will be composed of 4 parts. First of all, equality, then competence, measuring competence, third of all, legitimacy, and fourth of all, high school education. As I start with equality, government said that now the system favors inequality, but we can show you easily that if you think logically, standard tests will not bring down equality, maybe it will increase it. Why? Because first of all, as closing government said, you need expertise, you need to hire expertise to write an essay to help you deal with the interviews. But the time you need to hire that expertise is for like 4 or 5 hours, maybe a day. But if you need to study for an exam, study for a standard exam, you need to study for a long period of time. And for that time, if you're a rich student, you can hire private tutors for all year long. And it will create a huge difference between poor students and rich students who can hire private tutors for a very, very long time. And other than that, you need a lot of time to study for a standard test, more time than you need to study, you need to do for extracurricular activities. If you need to study for an exam, you have to have a stable home, you have to have a room where you can study in silence and for a long time. You don't need to, you can't study at the same time when you take care of your sisters, your brothers, your siblings. So it will bring down equality, as Shay said. And as closing government said, you are just a number when you just take the standard exam. But when you write an essay, you can mention your disadvantages. You can mention what happened to you. You can mention, I came from a socially or economically disadvantaged society or a family. This is why I had to work 3 hours after school, and this is why I didn't have any extracurricular. You can explain your situation. But if you have a disadvantage and because of that you can't study, you can't just say that you are just behind a student who is rich. And my second point is measuring competence. Especially in fields like science or computer education, it is more important to know if a student has studied programming, coding, than if he can answer English questions. So a university can measure competence better according to their specific subjects. For example, if I'm trying to choose students for law school, I can measure their competence by looking at their debate records or looking at their looking at their more English abilities other than their math scores. Or for example, if I'm choosing them for computer science, I can look at their coding experience other than standard test. So as we say, standard test, as Doğukan said, will lower the measuring of competence. I can take the question now. Closing government.
Non-quantitative methods will always value connections and well-known names more than they'll value intelligence and ambition.
Well, it's your point, and I can say easily that as opening opposition said, you can just make interviews blind. You can just mention if you're having disadvantages on your essay. And on to my next point, universities have quotas. And to my legitimacy point, universities have quotas. Universities have quotas for their different visions. Universities have quotas for their debate teams. Universities have quotas for their sport team. Universities have quotas for the students from another countries, from students from different perspectives. And if you just take out that flexibility, take out that quota, you can, it's not legitimate. You can just take away the university's ability to create a sport team. For example, the soccer league, football leagues in America just consist of university students, and they can choose that by measuring their sport activities. But if you just make a standard test to every athlete, the athlete's risk, at least chance of going into universities will drop significantly, and you will just push students to a limited area where only the student who can memorize things will go to universities. It's not legitimate for the students who have different abilities, and it's not legitimate for the universities who want to have different visions, who wants to hire the students who code 10 hours a day during high school, or who are real great athletes, and it's not legitimate because of that, as Doğukan mentioned. And my last and the most important point we brought to this debate, I think, it will hugely change how high schools educate their students. Right now, high schools to send their students to universities have a great motivation to help their students go to the social activities, take extra curriculum, attend sporting events or social clubs. But if you just rip that away, if you just say that now students have to take a standard test to go to universities, most of the, or all of the high school probably will just focus on how to make our students get better results. So they will just focus on that. They will just focus on how to make them memorize stuff, make them solve better math problems, other than encouraging them to go to sport activities, encouraging them to take social clubs, to take part in community, I forgot the word, community stuff. So my last point is, now I can't say it's perfect, but now high schools have a motivation to help their students go to different activities. It will encourage them to play basketball. It will encourage them to go to social clubs. It will encourage them to do other things other than just memorizing stuff. But if you just take standard tests, as in my country, these high school students won't have anything to do because their parents and their high school mentors just force them to study for the test. And as they can't just hire best tutors or won't have as much time as rich people, rich students, they will be just as disadvantaged. And as we mentioned, this and legitimacy part, just we brought those to this debate. We must win. Thank you. Have a good day.